Being born into a poor family really sucks. You go to school, get good grades, and then go to a job that barely pays you enough to meet your basic expenses. I would often dream of things I would buy, such as cars, houses, clothes, shoes. If only I had a way out of this paycheck-to-paycheck lifestyle, I would take it in a heartbeat. Before I continue sharing my story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Hit that notification button and you will become rich within the next 5 years. Dave and I met at the mall. I was purchasing some new work clothes when my card was declined. I was so embarrassed. He was next in line and offered to purchase my items. He asked if he could take me to lunch after, and I said yes. After going on a few dates, we decided to date exclusively. Unlike my previous boyfriends who ran to the bathroom before the check came or snuck us into the cinema, Dave showered me with gifts and actually paid the bill when we ate at restaurants. After a date with Dave, I would often go to work and boast about our date the day before. Last night, Dave and I went to La Chair. You know, you have to get reservations months in advance to even step into that place. After we had a lobster dinner, we took a ride in the limo around the city. I kept pictures of me and Dave stuck on my cubicle walls so everyone would know that I not only had a man, but a rich one at that. My plan was to keep this rich man in my life by any means possible, which also meant being protective of him and removing any female that I thought was a threat to our relationship. I must admit, yes, I am a bit of the jealous type, but who isn't? One night while getting ready for our date, Dave called. "Hey babe, I have a last-minute meeting with a new client, Mrs. Jacobs at La Chair, so I will have to postpone our date, okay?" "Sure, love, you go on and make that money," I said through a forced smile. Dave and I hung up and I screamed, "How dare he take some heifer to our spot?" I changed from my red dress and pulled on black sweatpants and sweatshirt. I grabbed my car keys and headed to La Chair. I parked a little away and walked towards La Chair. They had a beautiful open window so that I was able to see inside. There was my boyfriend laughing and drinking with her. After 3 hours, I saw Dave and the woman come out of the restaurant. I watched as he walked her to her car and gave her a kiss on the cheek before she got in. After she got into her car from the meeting, I followed her. On returning home, I wondered if I was making a mountain of a molehill. I hardly slept that night. The next day, Dave and I had lunch together. "So, how was your meeting yesterday?" I asked casually. "It was great. Mrs. Jacobs is excited to start working with us. I made the adjustments she wanted to the contract, but now I can't get a hold of her." "I'm sure she will turn up soon," I assured him. During lunch, Dave got a phone call. It was Mrs. Jacobs' assistant. Dave had a look of horror on his face when he came off the call. "What's wrong, Dave?" I asked. "It's Mrs. Jacobs. They found her car off a precipice off Old St. George's Road. They said she lost control of the vehicle and she died on impact." "Oh no," I mumbled. We ate the rest of our lunch silently. When we were finished, Dave paid the bill and we left. Dave walked me to my car. His facial expression changed to one of concern when he noticed I had a scratch on the front bumper of my car. "Babe, what happened to your car?" he said. I looked at him confused. "What are you talking about?" He leaned over and outlined the scratch and said, "This. What happened to your car?" I moved closer to Dave to see what he was talking about. "What the hell?" I said. "That wasn't there before. Someone scratched my car and had the audacity to just leave." I threw my hands up in the air. "Don't worry, babe. I'll pay to get it fixed," Dave said. "Are you sure?" I asked. "Of course I'm sure. I would do anything for my baby," he said as he pulled me into a quick kiss. "You really are the best. Okay, I have to run. I don't want to return to the office late." I jumped into my car and headed back to work. The next few days were tough on Dave after the disappearance of Mrs. Jacob. Dave started talking about his cabin on the lake. I was so excited when he invited me there to spend the weekend. He said he needed some time to clear his head. I was so excited to be away for the weekend, just me and him. When the doorbell rang, I ran to open it. However, I wasn't prepared for who I saw standing in front of me. Dave?" I said as I looked at him, then at the gorgeous brunette that was standing next to him with a smile on her face. "Hi, babe, this is Jade, my cousin," Dave said as he placed his hand casually around Jade's shoulders. Jade extended her hand towards me and I shook it. "Dave has told me so much about you. He really is a great guy," Jade said, looking up at Dave affectionately. "So, babe, are you going to let us in?" Dave asked. "Sure," I said as I moved to the side to let him in. I was boiling inside. How dare he bring another woman on our first weekend getaway? Who does that? Hey, babe, I still have a few things to pack. Do you want to help? I asked, taking his hand.
Sure, babe, he said, then turned to Jade. I'll be back.
Jade nodded. As soon as I closed my bedroom door behind us, I turned to Dave and said in a hushed tone, "What is she doing here? I thought that this weekend was a weekend getaway for two. We don't need a third wheel, Dave," I snapped.
Babe, it was a last-minute thing. Her dad called and asked if she could stay with me for the weekend since he wouldn't be in the country,
Dave said. So you are the only family she has? Are you trying out for the Best Cousin Award of the year? Because right now, you are a runner-up for the Worst Boyfriend of the Year, I hissed. I finished packing and Dave took the bags to the car. I sat in the front passenger seat, put my earphones on, and listened to music all the way to the lake. While in the cabin, Jade attempted to make small talk with me. I smiled and nodded and answered courteously, but all the while in my head, I had already ripped her head off and hung it on a spike. "Hey, who's up for a swim?" I said, clinging to Dave.
"Sure, why not? The last one to the lake is a rotten egg," he said.
We all scrambled outside to the lake. Then Dave's phone rang.
"Why don't you and Jade go ahead and I'll catch up,"
he said before answering the call. Jade and I entered the water. It was cool and refreshing, definitely what my bones needed after sitting in a car for over an hour. Jade relaxed in the water next to me, telling me about the courses she was doing in college and how she couldn't wait to leave college so she could work at her father's firm. My attention wasn't on Jade, though. My focus was on Dave. He kept his eyes focused on the water as he chatted on the phone. I gave him a small wave and he smiled and waved back. A few minutes after Dave walked into the cabin, I noticed that Jade was no longer rambling in my ears. "Jade? Jade!" I searched for her head frantically above the water. "Dave! Dave!" I called from the water. Dave ran out of the cabin. "I can't find Jade! I can't find Jade!" I said hysterically. Dave immediately dove into the water to look for his cousin. I held my breath and felt helpless. Maybe if I was paying attention to her, this wouldn't have happened. After what seemed like an eternity, I breathed a sigh of relief when I saw Dave's head, then Jade's.
"Call an ambulance,"
Dave yelled at me. I came out of the lake quickly and ran inside to call the ambulance while Dave did CPR on Jade. After calling the ambulance, I stood by the door of the cabin. "Please, Lord, let her be okay," I said, my eyes swelling with tears. Just then I heard Jade sputter, then cough. The ambulance came a few minutes later. Dave drove with the ambulance while I followed in the car. I arrived at the hospital and waited in the waiting area. After about 2 hours, I saw Dave and waved him over. "How is she? Will she be okay?" I asked, concerned.
"The doctor said that she'll be okay, but they're keeping her overnight for observation,"
Dave said as he hugged me. "I'm so sorry about how I reacted earlier. I was just excited to spend the weekend with you, you know? I just wasn't expecting her to be there. Now look what happened," I said as I burst into tears.
"It's okay, Kiara. Nobody could have predicted this. It wasn't your fault. Let's head home, okay?"
Dave said as he steered me to the exit of the hospital. Dave called the next day.
"I'm heading to the hospital to check Jade."
"I'd like to visit her. Do you think she would want to see me? I could bring her some flowers. Do you think she likes flowers?" I asked.
"I'm sure she would be happy to see you, and she loves flowers. Her favorite are lilies. She's in room 307,
Dave said. We said goodbye and I purchased the flowers. The door to Jade's room was slightly ajar. I could hear Jade and Dave talking inside in low whispers. "I'm telling you, Kiara had something to do with my accident. I was the junior swimmer championship winner 3 years in a row. There isn't any way I would just go under the water unless I was held," said Jade.
"Stop being so paranoid, Jade."
Dave sounded unconcerned.
"Kiara has been nothing but good to me. She isn't a killer. Yesterday was just a freak accident."
I waited a few seconds before knocking on the door. "Can I come in?" I said softly. Before Jade could answer, Dave said,
"Hi, baby. Sure, come on in."
I walked into the room and handed the flowers to Jade and said, "I'm so sorry about my attitude yesterday. I just wasn't expecting Dave to bring company on our first weekend together. Can you forgive me?" Jade looked at me and said coldly, "If anything happens to Dave, you will be the first person that I will be checking." My eyes widened. "What are you talking about?" Jade turned away from me and said nothing. I turned to Dave. "What is she talking about?" I asked, puzzled.
"Nothing,"
Dave said, scratching behind his head.
"Look, Jade, I called Uncle Ralph and he'll be here shortly to take you home."
Dave kissed Jade on the cheek, took my hand, and walked out of the hospital. It was Valentine's Day, and Dave said that he had a grand surprise for me. However, there was a business function that he needed to attend first. I honestly didn't mind, since I also had a work function to attend. While sitting through one of the boring speeches, the waiters were serving drinks. The coworker next to me nudged my arm and pointed discreetly. "Isn't that Dave?" she asked. "Where?" I said, looking around the room. "Over there by the door serving drinks," she said smugly. I reluctantly turned my head in the direction that my coworker pointed. There were hushed whispers at my table from my other coworkers. My eyes grew wide as there stood Dave in a black and white uniform with a serving tray in hand. I composed myself before I got up from the table and walked in the direction of where Dave stood. "What the hell is going on?" I hissed. Dave looked like a cat that caught the canary. "You better say something before I change the entire atmosphere up in here," I snarled. "I'm not who you think I am," Dave said as he tried to touch my arm, and I pulled away. "I'm not rich. I actually work for my uncle. He's this big executive and he's always away. He ensures that I have enough cash to entertain his clients in his absence. I actually still live at home with my parents and do odd jobs to make ends meet." I took one of the drinks off the serving tray and threw it in his face. "So you lied to me and made me look like a fool? Don't you dare come near me ever again. And don't bother calling," I said before turning and walking away. I woke up the next day to the sound of knocking on my door. "Mrs. Joseph, it's the police," the voice said on the other side of the door. I walked to the door groggily and opened it. "How can I help you?" I asked. "Mrs. Joseph, when was the last time you saw Mr. Dave Warren?" "Last time I saw him was last night when we broke up. What's this about?" I asked. A feeling of dread came over me. I lifted my hand to remove a strand of hair from my eyes. I held my breath as one of the officers said, "Mrs. Joseph, what's that on your hands, ma'am?" I looked at my hands. A dry red substance was over both my hands. "Mrs. Joseph, step out of the apartment with your hands up," one of the officers said. "What's this about?" I asked as I stepped out of the apartment. I was handcuffed and led to the police car by one of the officers. He said, "Mr. Warren was brutally attacked last night." Standing in front of my house was Jade. She looked on but said nothing. I was placed in the police vehicle and I looked back and saw her get into a car. She drove past the police car and I noticed that there was a scratch on the side of the door. I screamed from the back of the vehicle, "I'm innocent! I'm innocent!" What do you guys think of my story? Do you think I'm innocent or guilty?